In Los Angeles, a serial killer eludes police for months. The nightstalker strikes at random, kills at will. The terror he inspires is enormous. The clues he leaves are slight. But ultimately, they're all detectives have to track him down. Investigators at the scene of a strangling rely on an experimental technique to raise invisible clues. They have only one chance to get it right. If they fail, a killer will walk. Crime scenes can be misleading. They can hold plenty of secrets or next to nothing. Harvesting hidden clues is the first strike against the criminal. To catch him, detectives need to turn fleeting prints into lasting impressions. Despite their working familiarity with death, Los Angeles homicide investigators were chilled by the scene they encountered in the affluent community of Whittier on March 29, 1985. The ransacked condition of the house spoke of robbery as the primary motive. A VCR, video camera, and much of the couple's jewelry was taken. But the perpetrator also had a taste for blood. Vincent Zazzara had been killed by a .22 caliber bullet. His wife Maxine was shot in the head and mutilated. The forensics team went to work, but wouldn't find many clues. Though the killer had plundered the home with reckless abandon, he had taken care to protect his identity. Technicians dusting for fingerprints determined that the intruder had worn gloves. Whoever had committed these murders left few traces behind. The bullet slugs were too damaged to be of use. After hours of scouring the home for clues, detectives came up empty-handed. The killer, it appeared, had gotten away clean. But he hadn't covered all his tracks. Beneath an open window, detectives located his point of entry. Distinct footprints marked the soil. One of the two prints belonged to the homeowner, Vincent Zazzara. The other appeared to be the footwork of his killer. Technicians sprayed the print with a fixative, then poured plaster into the indentation. The shoe print was lifted from the ground and sent for analysis. At the sheriff's crime lab, criminalist Gerald Burke examined it.
I was asked to check pattern details, size, take measurements of the casts of the impressions, and to see what kind of information I could get from those shoe impressions with regard to manufacturer, make of the shoe, size of the shoe, things of that nature.
The more Burke could learn about the shoes, the better idea detectives would have about the man who filled them. Burke knew the cast was from an extremely large sneaker, but he couldn't determine what brand of shoe it was. In his years of experience, Burke had never come across a print like this. It wasn't in their reference library of tread patterns. He couldn't find it in shoe stores. It had to be a newly released model or an off-market brand. Either way, the print, like the spent bullets, led detectives to a dead end.
No, we didn't. Well, I don't know. They're still pretty young.
Without a source of comparison, Burke's analysis couldn't move the investigation forward. The Zazzara murders weren't the only case that had the sheriff's office puzzled. At the same time, detectives were trying to make sense of a homicide that had occurred less than 2 weeks before, 5 miles away in Rosemead in LA County. Maria Hernandez arrived home late one night and came face to face with the barrel of a .22. Inside the condominium, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, heard the gunshot. She died almost instantly.
Can you tell me what happened?
Maria Hernandez had been lucky.
Come home.
The keys in her hand deflected the bullet.
Go out, and
She played dead until the attacker left.
the gun was right in my face. Just
She
inches
told
from my
investigators
face,
that the
and-
killer was a
and I-
thin Hispanic man in his 20s, dressed all in black.
And I laid there. I just knew that I just needed to lay there. And
He
not
had
move.
black, bulging eyes, hollow cheeks, and rotting teeth.
Enough light to see.
Hernandez had no idea why he wanted her and her roommate dead.
How tall? Is he as tall as I am? Tall?
For a week, the case went nowhere. And then, in an equally random way, the Zazaras were killed. The .22 caliber slugs from both crimes were sent to the ballistics lab for comparison. They were too distorted to positively link them to the same gun. Even so, Detective Gil Carrillo of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office drew a connection between the homicides.
We had Maria Hernandez, who's surviving victim in the Hernandez case. You have her giving us a physical description and a drawing of an individual that assaulted her. We have a particular caliber gun. In the Zazara case, we have no physical description, but we have a shoe print. And we have the same caliber gun.
Not only did he see the two crimes as being connected, Carrillo believed they were part of a much bigger pattern. For weeks, violence had been on the rise in Los Angeles County, a 4,000 square mile area of 88 cities. Night after night throughout the county, the toll of murders, sexual assaults, and abductions grew. The media was in a frenzy, reporting crime after crime. And with each episode, the public's fear swelled. The crime lab worked overtime to process the evidence gathered at the scenes. They weren't coming up with much. Carrillo looked for a common thread in the spree of violence. Based on crime reports and conversations with witnesses, he forged a radical theory. His colleagues saw the crimes as LA's growing trend of violence. While they assumed that the crimes had several perpetrators, Carrillo believed they were all the work of a single man. But Carrillo was new to the homicide department. None of his colleagues bought his theory. Apart from the grotesque violence of the crimes, there was no common denominator to suggest they were committed by one man. The rookie's instinct defied conventional wisdom. The sheriff's department wouldn't entertain the idea of a serial killer until Carrillo could base his suspicion on fact.
And until you had enough physical evidence or conclusive evidence, it's difficult to sell everybody that one man was committing all the crimes that had been committed up until that time.
Before he could prove his theory, Carrillo needed a more definitive pattern to emerge. He wouldn't have to wait long. In the weeks following the Zazara murders, 7 victims throughout Los Angeles County were wakened in their beds. Women were bound with handcuffs, thumb cuffs, or electrical cords before being sexually assaulted. Houses were turned upside down. valuables stolen. Suburban bedrooms were now the most dangerous place in Los Angeles, and everyone was sleeping lightly. In early June, just 3 blocks from the Zazara's house, a deputy's wife was roused from her sleep. She thought she heard a window opening. Someone was in the house. Hearing the couple's movement, the prowler slipped away. The deputy called the sheriff's department. In the daylight, investigators found gouge marks where the prowler broke in. The deputy pointed investigators to the flower bed, where he'd covered some evidence with a shoebox. Beneath it was the imprint of a large athletic shoe. The waffle pattern was familiar. It looked just like the tread found outside the Zazara's house. It was the break detectives had been waiting for. If this print matched the print found at the Zazara murders, it would support Carrillo's theory that one man was stalking LA's neighborhoods. But if that were true, it meant that one lone killer had managed for 1 year to defy LA's best and brightest. Now that he had a basis for comparison, criminalist Gerald Burke examined the 2 plaster casts taken from the crime scenes. He determined the prints were made by shoes of the same model, but not necessarily by the exact same shoe. Because both prints were left in coarse dirt, Burke was unable to identify the subtle marks that make each shoe unique.
Things like little nicks and cuts and scratches, or something that can be used as an identification, more or less like a fingerprint in one shoe sole to another.
This was of little help to detectives. In a county of 7.5 million people, they could not track a man solely by his tread marks. But it was all they had to go on. And it kept showing up again and again. Since the Zazara murders, the large waffle pattern was found in the mud outside a Monterey Park homicide and was stamped in blood inside the home of a severely beaten old woman in Monrovia. Burke had 3 casts and 1 shoe print to work with. The crimes remained unsolved. The shoe prints remained a mystery. Then, a summer intern casually walking by a lab table made a pivotal observation.
And she said, "Oh, that's an Avia." And everybody just stopped and looked at her and said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah, I got a pair in my trunk." So she goes to the trunk of her car and pulls out this pair of Avia shoes, and that's when everything broke loose.
Avia was a new brand, explaining why the department had no information on them. In order to learn everything they could about this shoe, investigators went to Avia headquarters in Portland, Oregon. The company's designer identified the model number of the shoe that made the print. Burke pressed for more information.
I asked him to be a little bit more specific, and he said that he actually designed that shoe, and that he had a patent on that particular shoe sole design, and that there were no other patterns that were close.
The pattern was from an aerobic shoe that had only been on the market for 4 months. Only 1,300 pairs had been manufactured. Avia provided Burke with a number of soles from the factory so that he could accurately determine the size of the shoe that left the print. The rate of motion and the texture of the ground can greatly distort the impression. The only way to size the shoe was to compare tread patterns. The pattern details on the sole increase as the shoe size increases.
Down here in the bottom of the shoe, actually the mid portion of the shoe, you'll see that there are a number of chevrons. And these chevrons actually increase in number with the increasing shoe size. And the plaster casts, although they weren't good enough quality to record the Avia logo, they were good enough quality to allow me to count these pattern elements, these pattern details.
After counting the lines on the plaster casts, Burke was able to identify every cast he had as coming from a size 11.5 shoe. When he examined the marketing material from the manufacturer, he realized what a crucial discovery he'd made. Of the 1,300 pairs of this model manufactured, only 6 had been shipped to Los Angeles. Of those 6, only 1 was an 11.5. Only a handful of men in the country owned size 11.5 Avias. Carrillo's improbable theory of a single killer was now glaringly real.
When you start throwing the odds of more than one person wearing that particular model and size of shoe, it becomes, it narrows it down quite a bit that not more than one person is committing the crimes. When you have physical descriptions coupled with physical shoe prints, you've got, I mean, that's a neon sign saying, come get me. That's one man.
One very dangerous man that required county-wide attention. And getting him wouldn't be easy. They didn't know who he was, but terror had a name. The media dubbed him the Nightstalker. The Sheriff's Department organized a task force of homicide detectives. Carrillo teamed up with Frank Salerno. From his experience hunting some of LA's most deadly serial killers, Salerno knew what kind of challenges they faced.
It's very frustrating. You know, there's one individual out there that's committing all these crimes, and very violent, serious crimes, and you want to bring it to an end as quickly as you can.
The task force started small, then swelled as evidence accumulated.
At one point, we had about 75 investigators working in the bureau at that time, and we were using 1/3 of them just to investigate the Nightstalker series.
The Nightstalker held Los Angeles in a reign of terror during the summer of 1985. Night after night, people were struck down in the place they used to feel safest, their own homes. Pressure to solve the case was tremendous. But until detectives like Gil Carrillo uncovered the Nightstalker's identity, they couldn't calm the panic.
Gun sales went up, burglar alarm systems went up. Everybody was locking their windows and doors during a very, very warm summer. And you're talking about something that just took over the entire county of Los Angeles.
Law enforcement took to the streets. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods where the Nightstalker had struck, hoping that someone recognized him. They found nothing but petrified residents, and they knew better than to go at night. After dark, people weren't opening their doors to anyone. Sergeant John Yarborough was responsible for collecting evidence connected to the crimes.
In one house, I found a couple who had abandoned sleeping in their bed. They'd created dummies in the bed. The husband was sleeping routinely in the garage, and the wife was sleeping behind a television with the portable telephone. I mean, that was the kind of fear and panic that developed over this case.
Whether he killed his victims or let them live seemed as random as the rest of his behavior. Those who survived his attacks described, as Maria Hernandez had, a tall man with bulging eyes. He was saturated in a rank, leathery odor.
All right, and how about the mouth?
A little
Too short?
With the help of an identikit, a staff artist created a likeness of the man who had attacked them.
Did he have a
makes
mustache, any facial hair?
that looks good. So good to you? Yeah, looks good. I think that's him. I think that's it.
Detectives knew what he looked like, but he thwarted every effort to find him. The Night Stalker's unpredictability made his next move impossible to anticipate. Most serial killers conform to a regimented routine. This one seemed to work at random. He hit neighborhoods all over Los Angeles. His victims, both men and women, varied in age, ethnicity, and economic background. His MO was all over the map.
What we had was a man that sometimes used a gun, sometimes used a knife, sometimes used blunt force trauma, some he raped, some he didn't, some he strangled, some he just stomped to death, some he robbed, some he didn't.
The only thing he never changed was his shoes.
I'll tell you what, I'll lock down some things
To
here,
track
then
the
I'll
Night
be
Stalker,
on my way
Gerald
as
Burke
soon as
had
I
to
can.
become an expert in the
Okay?
killer's
But you
footwear.
make sure everybody's real careful about
He was
where they walk.
dispatched to any crime scene that
All right.
seemed remotely linked to him.
Okay, that sounds good.
I was out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on one side of the county, and at 6 o'clock in the morning I would be called to another side of the county, and I was just all over the place.
And though detectives could track the killer by his shoe prints, they always lagged one step behind him. On July 5th, they followed his tracks to the posh community of Sierra Madre.
Dad!
That morning, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett woke up backwards in bed. She had a searing headache. While the Bennett family slept just feet away, the girl had been beaten near death with a tire iron. She remembered nothing about the attack, but the familiar calling card was there. Sergeant John Yarborough speculated that the killer had 2 reasons for wearing the same shoes over and over again. First, they were functional. They allowed him to move surreptitiously or run if he needed to. Secondly, they'd never let him down.
But psychologically, it may have been the good luck shoes. He always wore them. They were always successful. He was always able to do what he wanted to do when he was wearing these shoes, so they had a good feeling for him.
The brutality of the crimes advertised the killer's lack of remorse and his delight in causing death.
I would say that he's a very good example of the predator-type offender who clearly just does not care about the victims that he comes in contact with. And he achieves a degree of thrill from it. That motivates him. Now, is he intelligent and cunning and clever? Well, he was certainly clever enough.
The Night Stalker was crazy like a fox and just as hard to corner. The task force wasn't enough. If detectives were going to capture this serial killer, they needed to spread out. Investigators made a videotape for LA County's 63 police departments. On the tape, Carrillo detailed the evidence gathered from the crime scenes. The suspect was a young Hispanic male who always wore a Vias. An expert cat burglar, it was impossible to tell if his primary motive was killing or robbery. As the body count grew, a few patterns emerged. He seemed to target yellow or beige houses. He sometimes drew pentagrams at the crime scene. But this information brought detectives no closer to identifying the horrible face that haunted Southern California. The violence reached a frenzy as the summer of 1985 wore on. By early August, the Night Stalker was suspected of killing 13 people and attacking 10 others. His activity in and around Los Angeles seemed to be accelerating. law enforcement braced for his next assault. And then, nothing. For the first time in months, nights were passing peacefully. But not for long. On August 18th, the Night Stalker struck again, this time in San Francisco. Peter and Barbara Pan, a couple who lived in a yellow house, were found murdered. It was the typical pattern: forced entry in the middle of the night, brutal murders, pentagrams, and stolen valuables. The unpredictable Night Stalker had just expanded his territory by 380 miles. The entire state was now under his grip. Where he'd strike next, no one could predict. San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein called a press conference to calm the citywide hysteria. But she divulged sensitive forensic information detailing the sneakers and the ballistics findings. Detectives believed the Night Stalker was following his case in the media. All along, he had enjoyed toying with law enforcement. Now that he knew exactly what they had on him, the advantage was his. He was likely to change his MO, and he was sure to discard his signature footwear. But a few good things came out of the media hype. San Francisco newspapers publicized the items of jewelry stolen from the Pans. A $10,000 bounty was placed on the Night Stalker's head. Informants started coming out of the woodwork. An informant, Donna Myers, told police that a man named Rick from El Paso had given her a bracelet and some rings.
He was very tall.
Like the description of the Night Stalker, Rick had terrible teeth, smelled bad, and was always spouting off about the virtues of
He was
Satan.
about my length, very full.
Police learned his last name was Ramirez.
Very dark brown to black.
Police now knew who he was, but they still had to find him. The Los Angeles phone book was full of men named Richard Ramirez. A fingerprint lifted from a stolen car at a crime scene pointed the finger of blame at a single suspect.
When Ramirez's name came up, they pulled all the Ramirez's that had been arrested, which there were numerous of them, Richard Ramirez's, and they physically checked it just like you would by eye and made that identification.
Once they determined which Ramirez they were after, surveillance personnel were deployed all over Los Angeles. They concentrated on places Ramirez was known to frequent. One of those places was the bus depot. Uniformed officers and undercover cops swarmed the station. But since they were looking for a man attempting to leave LA, they didn't pay attention to arriving passengers. Ramirez, returning from Tucson, spotted the undercover officers before they saw him. He slipped out of the bus terminal and went to an East LA bodega for some breakfast. He quickly realized that he was the center of attention. El Matador, they whispered, the killer. Police were called. The chase was on. Ramirez ran for his life along the 5 freeway.
He ran like a gazelle. He literally ran at a full sprint, probably a good 2-3 miles. Kept going, went over 10-foot sound walls, crossed 8 lanes of the 5 freeway right here.
The fugitive made his way into a residential neighborhood of East LA. He saw his only way out, but it wouldn't take him far. police interceded. The man they protected from attack was the man they'd been hunting for months. Their prime suspect, Richard Ramirez. At the police station, all eyes moved toward his shoes. They weren't Avia's. The Night Stalker was too clever to wear those again, but they were size 11.5. It seemed they had their man, but they didn't have his shoes. As always, it appeared the Night Stalker remained one step ahead of them.
Pinky, let's see your pinky.
Both Carrillo and his partner Frank Salerno believed that Richard Ramirez was the Night Stalker, but they didn't have the notorious sneakers. To build their case, the detectives would need to carefully draw together the web of evidence. Their first task was to interview the suspect. His demeanor surprised them.
Very soft-spoken. For lack of a lot of education, he was well-spoken also. Probably the thing that sticks in my mind the most is when you walk into an interview room with a suspected killer, is you usually introduce yourself, you tell them who you are. And I walked in and sat down, he says, "You're Frank Salerno."
Ramirez knew of him from the Hillside Strangler case, involving a pair of high-profile serial killers Salerno helped nab 6 years earlier. Detectives learned that their suspect had a vast working knowledge of serial killers throughout history. He knew all of their names, their methods, and the details of their captures. He had followed the Night Stalker case in the media. Though he never admitted to any crimes, Ramirez engaged detectives in a conversation about LA's latest serial killer.
He would talk to us in the third person. I didn't do this, but the Night Stalker might have done this. And the Night Stalker might have done this and this, and what do you think he'd have done over here?
Ramirez never confessed, so investigators looked for hard evidence to tie Ramirez to the crime spree. Inside his wallet, they had found a claim ticket for a piece of luggage at the bus station. Everything was removed and photographed. The bag contained a revolver and several kinds of ammunition, including .22 caliber cartridges. The evidence was bagged for further analysis. The shells and slugs collected from various crime scenes were taken to the ballistics lab to compare against those taken from the bag. They matched. Also, Ramirez's fingerprints were found on some of the items, confirming that the bag and its contents belonged to him. Most of the Night Stalker's surviving victims picked him out of a lineup. The eyewitness accounts, ballistics, fingerprint, and shoeprint evidence provided police with enough to arrest Ramirez for the Night Stalker crimes. 3 years after the arrest, the case finally went to trial. By this time, police suspected that he had killed 16 people and assaulted 11 others. The suspect made no show of repentance. During a preliminary hearing, he sported a pentagram on the palm of his hand. He waved it about, shouting, "Hail Satan." Though no size 11.5 Avia aerobic sneakers were recovered among Ramirez's belongings, it was the prints found in 8 of the crime scenes that held the case together. They formed an irrefutable physical link between the string of burglaries, rapes, and murders. Eyewitness testimony tied the man in court to other crimes, even when no print was present. The most expensive trial Los Angeles had yet seen came to a close after more than a year with a victory for the prosecution. In November 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death 19 times. Richard Ramirez was one of the most horrifying monsters to terrorize the country. But whether a killer takes many lives or only one, the motivation to kill remains the same. Murder is the ultimate selfish act. On September 2nd, 1990, in Des Moines, Iowa, William Helm and his brother stopped by the home of his estranged wife to pick up some tools. The house was locked. There was no sign of his wife. He could see their son playing unsupervised. He became alarmed.
Susan? Susan? Susan?
Then he found her in the bedroom. Helm called the police. Officers arrived to find a woman's nude body lying in bed. A blanket was pulled up to her chin. Susan Helm, a 24-year-old housewife, was last seen alive at 2 a.m. when neighbors picked up a child she'd been babysitting. The same clothes she'd been wearing the previous night were crumpled on the bedroom floor.
What time did you guys get here?
Police asked William Helm about his relationship with his wife. He told them they were separated and he had moved out. He said he had last seen her the day before when he dropped off their son. They learned through interviews with the couple's friends that there had been a history of domestic violence. A police report stated that William had assaulted Susan 9 months earlier. Nothing in the house seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of burglary. Captain James Trotter of the Des Moines Police Department led the investigation.
We have a routine that we go through on all crime scenes, particularly indoor crime scenes, and we start from the outside and work towards the center to preserve as much of the evidence and photograph it as we possibly can.
The forensics team methodically combed the house in search of the smallest clue as to what took place. Though the victim was nude, they found no evidence of sexual assault. Technicians couldn't find hair, fingerprints, or blood samples to link the killer to his crime. The ligature mark around her neck told of a brutal death by strangulation. Detectives formed some theories. Because of the way in which the body had been covered, they believed that the victim had been killed by someone she knew. Someone who cared enough to conceal her nudity from strangers.
Usually what happens is that after the crime has been committed, then they think, oh my God, somebody's going to see my wife or girlfriend or cousin or whatever the circumstance is, and they'll cover them up. So it's a good clue, simply that. It's just a clue to lead us in a direction in our investigation.
As the bedding was examined, they uncovered another clue. Beneath the blanket, the body had been placed on top of a sheet, and on that sheet was an oily mark that looked like a shoe print.
I think you might have some imprints on the
The print wasn't distinct enough to be used for comparison, but it suggested that the body had been moved.
Walk up alongside of the bed if you could. Pull that sheet back just a tad.
And so we concluded from that more than likely someone stood on the bed and maybe pulled or lifted the body onto the bed.
Samples of the blood. Okay.
The oily shoe print was made by automotive grease, embedded with small metal fragments. William Helm welded mufflers for a living. Though the print made him the prime suspect, it would be difficult to build a case against him. The physical evidence, it seemed, would only prove something he'd already admitted, that he'd entered the home, gone into the bedroom, and found the body.
I was gonna pick up my daughter, so I pulled up.
Helm was brought to the police station to make an official statement. Investigators tried to pin him down about any physical contact he may have had with the victim's body when he found her.
I knocked on the door and then there was no
Helm
answer.
claimed that he hadn't moved the bedding at all. He'd only used his fingertips to check her pulse at the wrist and neck.
And so it was critical that we have some physical evidence, otherwise we were only going to have a circumstantial case and probably not anything that we could arrest anybody for.
Detectives hoped that the body would disclose the secrets that the rest of the house had been hiding. More than a shooting or stabbing, strangulation requires close contact with the victim. Surely the killer left something behind. Detectives used an alternative light source to search for hair or fibers. Again, they found nothing. Unless a substantial clue surfaced soon, there would be no way to catch this killer. As investigators finished their search of the crime scene, they realized that they were being watched. After leaving the police station, Helm had returned to the scene of the crime. He pulled a lawn chair out of his car and set up an observation post on the neighbor's lawn. Peculiar behavior for someone who just lost his spouse.
That type of interest is usually to spectators who don't know these people, and normally the family is somewhere else consoling one another.
You never touched your wife. You went directly.
Helm's detached interest in the case fueled detective suspicions.
Never touched your wife. No.
They asked him to come to the station for another interview.
You wanna know why?
After almost 2 hours of questioning, police obtained enough information to get a warrant to collect samples of his hair, saliva, blood, and handprints.
Okay, pull it up.
In order to prove that Helm had killed his wife, police would have to find evidence that he was the one who moved the body. If Trotter's team could find Helm's fingerprints on a portion of the victim's skin that had been beneath the blanket, they'd be able to test his story. But they faced a big obstacle. In the field, no one had ever successfully lifted finger or palm prints from a body before. Des Moines police had tried and failed 6 times before. At a crime scene, it is difficult to control the variables required for success. Proper timing, temperature, and humidity were crucial. The experimental technique to raise fingerprints from skin had only succeeded in laboratories. If they could make it work at a real crime scene, it would bring criminal investigation to a whole new level of precision. The technique relies upon superglue's ability to turn the human touch into a permanent imprint. Years ago, workers at a superglue factory noticed that if they weren't careful, they left their fingerprints on the glue packaging. And because of their exposure to the glue fumes, these fingerprints couldn't be wiped off. Vaporized superglue, or cyanoacrylate ester, adheres to the oil deposited by the human touch. It attaches to fingerprints on hard substances such as glass or metal, creating a thin shell over the ridged pattern. It actually seals the print under a layer of plastic. In most cases, this pattern can then be dusted and lifted with tape. But lifting a delicate print off a textured, oily surface like skin is a tricky procedure. If there were any prints on Susan Helm's body, they wouldn't survive a trip to the coroner's office. The slightest change in temperature or the lightest brush against the body could ruin them. The testing would have to be done where the body lay.
All we could see was maybe
In the lab, the technique had succeeded only on prints less than 4 hours old. Susan Helm had been dead for more than 12 hours. But it was the only hope police had of tying the murderer to the crime. The first step was to build a tent around the victim. A plastic drop cloth was wrapped around the frame and secured. Temperature within the tent must be increased to speed the evaporation of the glue. In the field, it's difficult to control. Liquid superglue was placed in aluminum dishes and set on burners inside the tent. The glue was heated for 10 minutes until fumes filled the structure. Technicians allowed 30 minutes for the glue to set. After the fumes settled, technicians moved in. Whatever lay beneath the plastic would make or break the case. If they could find a good quality print, they might be able to catch a killer. But if history were any guide, they'd find only a degraded print or none at all. And that meant a killer would walk. The plastic was peeled back from the body. Technicians searched for the ridges of a human fingerprint with a halogen flashlight. Shining the light at an angle helps the prints stand out. Passing over the lower portion of the victim's abdomen, the light revealed a pattern. It wasn't a fingerprint. It was larger and more distinct than they could have imagined. The print from practically an entire hand. The potential proof was there for the investigators to see. But success still seemed just beyond their grasp. For the first time in forensic history, scientists had been able to coax a latent print from a human body outside of the laboratory. But collecting the print would be another matter. Lifting it with tape would likely destroy it. Scientists needed to lift the print photographically. The photographed print from the victim's belly was delivered to the Des Moines Police Department Crime Lab, where it was compared to the print taken from William Helm. When comparing two fingerprints, identification technicians use a computer to look for matching patterns. Because palm prints are so intricate, technician Jerry Wilson had to make the comparison manually. The time-consuming task requires him to pinpoint areas where ridges join, diverge, or form dots.
The ridge on the outside.
Using those patterns as reference points, Wilson compares the prints for similarities.
And we look for these same identical points in the same relative unit space in each between the latent and the ink print, and the same amount of intervening ridges. And we also look for discrepancies, because if there's unexplained discrepancies, then you have to either eliminate the print altogether or explain why there is a discrepancy.
Technicians found no such discrepancies between the prints. Instead, they identified a highly unusual formation on both.
There was a double loop formation in the palm print, which is very unusual.
Go ahead, zoom in
And
a
that
little
helped
more.
to locate the pattern
Yeah,
area,
more.
and it made the comparison much easier
bit
between the
more.
inked and the
Okay.
latent print.
Right here we've got an upward ending ridge.
Wilson can call two prints a match if they share 8 common reference
Ending ridge
points.
right there.
In the Helm case, technicians stopped counting
This
at
is kind of
90.
up in the interdigital area, so we got 2 delta
It was one of the most
formations.
obvious matches their office had ever come across.
There.
The discovery of William Helm's palm print on his dead wife's belly proved he was lying. He was the one who placed her into bed. It seemed police had caught the killer with a drop of glue. But to make a conviction stick, they needed to connect him directly to the murderous act. The victim wasn't strangled with bare hands. The killer had used a length of wire. Police had enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Helm's apartment. There, they found the final piece of the puzzle. The garrote, a piano wire stretched between 2 wooden handles, has only one purpose: strangulation. Though tests in the lab showed no trace evidence on the wire, its gauge was consistent with the marks on the victim's neck. Trotter pieced together a likely scenario of the murder. On the morning she was killed, Susan and William Helm had argued for the last time. William became enraged and took her life. He tried to cover his deed with a blanket, but the persistence and methodical attention to detail of the Des Moines Police Department produced the clue that marked him as a killer. William Helm was convicted of first-degree murder in the strangling death of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The forensic evidence in this case was extremely important because of the lack of witnesses and blood and all those other kinds of things that you can typically use to prove your case. So the fingerprint, the palm print in this case was the turning point for us.
By making sense of obscure prints, forensic scientists helped expose the crimes of Richard Ramirez and William Helm. Thanks to advances in technology, murderers like them can no longer escape the lasting impressions they leave behind.